Greetings ladies and gents, and welcome to this match video for Mud's mission taken from the website Royal Road. As always, I hope that you all enjoy this episode, and if you do, please consider supporting the channel. Also, all of these episodes will be available as a podcast on the various different podcast platforms. All the links will be down below. Chapter 89, Makeshift Man-Trap. An expanse of densely concentrated mana exists at the center of this world. Deep below, beyond mortal sight, lies the abyss. Through some vile machinations of the unnameable has the intent of the demiurge been brushed aside. Free from the guiding hand of the divine, evil minds have taken control. It is a realm of utter darkness, for light does not exist in this place. It is a land with no direction, for the pull of the land towards the center of the globe has no sway. It is utterly cold, for there exists no heat. All that we take for granted, all truths which are ascribed to the world, do not exist in the abyss. For 1 week of mind or body, merely entering means certain destruction. One must enforce their own vision of self to existence without the aid of Yaldabaoth, should they wish to traverse the accursed realm. Lifeless objects are obliterated without fail, their forms wiped away with the pure energies of creation. Only objects imbued with powerful ideals can withstand the abyss for any measure of time. But even such artifacts are eventually corroded to nothing. Only the corrupted forms of demons seem to home in the silence. On the edge of the abyss rages an eternal struggle, the demons who plot to expand the domain of the abyss, and the servants of the archons who hold them back. I wish to say that the succeeding history has only ever shown that the realm of the abyss to expand. Unless the expansion is slowed, then it is only a matter of time until the abyss reaches the surface. If such a thing should ever come to pass, then all hope is truly lost. Life as we know it will cease to exist. Excerpt from the Containment of the Abyss. Time was a resource of uncertain value at the moment. How long Jabrax could require to begin moving dimension, and how long Mud had to prepare before any soldiers arrived. It was even possible that they would never arrive at all. To be safe, Mud would assume the worst-case scenario, that it was still possible to prepare for. Many low-strength enemies arriving in less than an hour, Mud began calling out to the human resources it now had available to it. Responding to the golem's mental summons, 4 humans quickly made their way outside. Novus was shocked when 2 humans she did not recognize exited the mansion's front door into the yard. An elderly man in an orange robe and a pointed hat, and a thick human male with a pointy tail and a blank expression on his face. "Oh, so that's where you went off to, Jericho." Getting no reply, Cobb waved his hand in front of the thick human's face, who again did not react. "GreatGreenGoo." Hello there, are you Mr. Sithlaw?" Novus shifted nervously as she spoke to the old man. "I've heard some amazing stories about you, sir." "Of course that's not Sithlaw. I already told you he's dead. That must be a body double. Try keep it up." Cobb walked confidently over to the old man and circled around him, leaning in to examine him closely. Stopping in front of him, Cobb reached up and pulled open the mouth and examining his teeth. "Wow, is this bark? That's a hell of a makeover." Cobb stepped back and crossed his arms, seeming to lose interest now that he had the mystery solved. "Humans begin constructing traps around the house. You have 30 minutes. 30 minutes? That's not enough time," protested Novus. Cobb rubbed his chin. "I could probably make some pitfall traps. Begin immediately." "Hold up." Cobb held up his hand. "Do you expect me to dig with my bare hands?" "Yes." The swordsman shrugged and shook his head slowly. "I need tools. At least give me a shovel." Mud contemplated for a moment. There were no simple tools in the mansion, and the great enchanter perhaps seeing no need for such mundane objects. That being the case, and not having the time to waste returning to Galtheus, the only option was to quickly make the tools. Mud held one of his arms aloft, concentrating its will. It pinched the elbow smaller and smaller until, with a plop, the arm completely separated and fell to the floor. Maximum HP reduced by 4. Making use of the first time of his new rare skill division, Mud focused to maintain control of the removed limb. Surprisingly, the task was no more difficult than controlling the flesh while attached to its own body. With a shift of its amorphous form, Mud transformed and removed the limb into a shape of a shovel, then hardened the tool to the strength of solid stone. After throwing the shovel at Cobb, Mud repeated the process 3 more times. At the end, Mud's main body had been reduced to 2/3 of its original size. Novus expressed concerns about using her boss's removed body parts as a tool, but Mud disregarded her complaints as illogical. As Cobb continued to dig in with interest, he called out to Mud, "So, Mud, seeing you shapeshifting give me a better idea. How wide can you spread yourself?" 3 Republic scouts slowly crept their way towards the woods east of Galtheus, up the winding path and into the woods. An order had come down that they were to reconnoiter the home of a powerful individual who lived near the city. Their first task was to confirm that he was present. If the house was abandoned, then the scouts were to secure the location and claim any valuables to be redistributed to the people of the Republic. Unfortunately, the 3 assigned to the task were not actually trained scouts, due to the lack of qualified personnel. The elected commander had simply selected 3 soldiers which had the sneak skill at the highest ranks. A lean man with greasy black hair, the way in a low crouch, having been elected into the position of mission commander by his 2 colleagues. Behind him followed a similarly thin woman with green hair and pointed ears, and a demi-rabbit with a particularly animal-like face poking out of its thick metal armor. As the trio advanced through the forest and a short distance from the trail, the silence was broken by a clang of metal. "Shh!" The mission commander turned towards the demi-rabbit, who gave an apologetic look while sniffing at the air. "Sorry, sir. My equipment is not suitable for the mission." The commander knew the soldier. He had a nervous personality and possessed a slight stutter. If they should have ever needed combat, he would become the most valuable asset, being a skilled brawler. "Just be more careful. The clearing to the house should be just ahead." Then again, pushing through the thick underbrush, his intuition soon proved correct. Around the copse of trees came into view of Sithlar estate. "Commander!" The female elf spoke up from beside him in a low whisper. Well, the elves were not a populous group, and thereafter had little voting power in the Republic. He didn't agree with the way others would look down on them. Every species was a valuable cog in the society of Fagia. He would not hold her politically disadvantageous background against her. "The house does not match with our intelligence." "What do you mean?" "The design looks the same to me." The group had been provided with a memory imprinting of the target before leaving the temporary camp set up outside Galtheus' city walls. Pulling the scroll from his printing out of his messenger bag, the commander compared it to the building in front of them. It was, without a doubt, the same structure. "I mean, how clean it looks. Someone has cleared away the moss and birds' nests from the roof, removed the trash from behind the building, and even got the grass in the yard." The owl's sharp eyes darted between the image and the commander's hand and the building. "That dirt path through the yard and the front door is also new." "So he cleaned the place up. Isn't that normal?" The over-armored demi-rabbit on the commander's opposite side mumbled. "It would have taken many years and neglect for it to have gotten that bad." The elf jabbed a finger into the picture. "A change like that doesn't happen for no reason. We should be wary of what brought it on." "Right. We were going to be careful regardless, refrain from making useless observations." Despite the altruistic respect for elves as citizens, he wasn't just going to let someone with barely any clout tell him what to do. After looking around for a moment, he crept out onto the yard. "I don't see anyone around. Let's take a look through the windows." Moving up to the window, he was disappointed to find them all well covered from the inside by curtains. No matter how he angled his head, he could not see into the house itself. Circling around the building, being extra careful to peer around the corners first, he found all of them to be in the same state. Upset while he repeated failures, he rounded the corner in the final wall. His flagging spirits were lifted as he spotted a window with open curtains. After exchanging glances, the trio advanced with utmost care towards the window. Carefully peeking over the edge, he spotted his target. Sitting at a table in what appeared to be the kitchen was an old man in an orange robe, slowly eating a bowl of soup. Although he could only be seen by the back of the man from the window, he was confident that that was Sithlar who they were looking at. Turning back towards his group, he waved them over frantically. Moving with extreme care, they each rose up to look for themselves. The owl seemed reluctant to join him under the window, but a more aggressive hand order finally got her to join him below the windowsill. At that moment, the floor vanished beneath the floor, and their lack of proper training exposed itself as both men screamed in surprise. Only the elf remained silent. After a short drop and only 2 units, the trio slammed into the dirt below. Such was a short fall wouldn't be dangerous even to a walled civilian. So the professional soldiers were only mildly disoriented. The same could not be said, however, for the swirling maroon mist which awaited them inside the hole. After a few panicked breaths as they tried to comprehend the situation, the commander and the demi-rabbit quickly fell into a peaceful sleep. Unlike her graceless companions, the elf managed to land lightly on her feet at the bottom of the small pit. Recognizing the mist of some sort of poison, she quickly covered her mouth with a bandana that she had worn loosely around her neck. Before she could leap out the pit, however, the sky closed above her. Just as quickly as the floor had vanished, it had now regrown. Pulling the rapier from his side, she desperately struck the obstacle, managing to pierce clean through it. As soon as she retracted her sword, however, the dirt simply flowed back into place. When she tried to strike the surface and jump and kick, it stretched out and deformed with surprising elasticity. Calling on the ideal of nature, she tried to pull apart the dirt with grass. Just like her blade, the mud simply flowed around the grasping roots like water. Desperately, she even tried to control the flowing mud itself with the ideal of earth, an ideal which she had very little insight into. As she feared, she was unable to overcome that which already animated the dirt. Giving up on piercing the roof of the pit, she shifted her mana towards the walls and found success. Unlike the moving mud above her head, the walls of the tunnel appeared to be made from normal dirt. She had to work quickly, however. Already the grass was sleeping through her imperfections in her mask, and she was beginning to feel tired. Cobb crawled out from the pit from the front window, taking a rag from the place that Jericho stood nearby. He wiped the blood from his curved blade. "I took care of them." Turning around, he looked down into the pit while cleaning his weapon. "I'm amazed that this all worked out so well. I thought we might get one in this trap, but to think that we got all 3 of them in the stand here at the same time." "Cobb, should we expect more enemies?" "Hard to say." Cobb returned to the clean weapon to his sheath. "When the 3rd one gets back to the camp, they'll organize a response. I didn't see any long-range communication tools on the one that was acting like the boss, so they probably were meant to report back physically. That gives us some time. When they respond, though, they will be with force. It won't be this easy again. Again, they might not attack us if they're scared enough of Sithla." "Give me a conservative estimate of how much time we have to prepare." "I don't know. Maybe half a day. If they suspect Sithla is here and hostile, they won't attack carelessly. They probably never expected their scouts to be in mortal danger with this task." Cobb giggled while looking at the 2 corpses. "Normally, I would think that they wouldn't come back at all, but, something about the way Jibrax was acting earlier makes me think there's something else going on. We should expect a response." Mudd was pleased with that time frame. Jibrax had made reasonable progress on determining the control mechanism of the mansion. With luck, they might even be gone before the second group of humans even arrive. With that in mind, Mudd once again called out to his pets. "Humans, we will return to the slums for my next plan. Simple is better than complex for plans, you know. Why don't we just dig more holes? My plans have a high success rate. Therefore, any plan I create is likely to work. Digging holes wasn't my plan, so it doesn't benefit from this increased success rate. I don't think you're using statistics right." Despite his protest, the scarred human followed the golem. Whatever the weird construct had in mind, he was sure to be hilarious. End of chapter. Chapter 90. Moving and Majoritarianism. Mudd and its humans quickly returned to the slums outside of Galtheus' city walls. Jibrax remained at the mansion to continue examining the control mechanisms, and Bark remained to avoid any complications from Sithla being spotted near the city. As Mudd's group approached the edges of the forest, Nova spoke up from her spot at base behind Gollum. "Sir, what if the enemy soldiers notice us? With her slow and careful movements, the swordswoman peeked out around the edge of the conifer that she hid behind, examining the empty streets for any sign of movements. In that scenario, we will flee. In order to reduce all likelihood of such an event, we will be working quickly. So, Cobb jumped in from Jericho's shoulder, who had carried him down the hill. What do we come here for? What are we looting? A house. After a moment of thought, Cobb burst into laughter. Mud ignored the outburst and proceeded towards a poorly constructed, although large, wooden shack. The golem circled the building once and then climbed over the top. After a quick examination of every nook and cranny of the weather-worn structure, Mud dropped the cobblestone streets. Next, Mud entered the unlocked front door and disappeared from sight. A moment later, he crawled out of the hole in the roof. This building is suitable. Mud then began putting off small chunks of his own flesh, using the same combination of skills as it had been used to craft shovels. Mud bound the more poorly fastened boards, beams, and planks more securely to the structure. On the cobblestone streets below, the humans simply gawked at the strange actions, aside from Jericho, who, as usual, stared vacantly into the air. Finished with its task, Mud once again returned to the road. The golem placed 2 muddy paws on the side of the shack and released a powerful wave of mind mana into the building. I have reduced the weight and friction of the structure. Each human lift a corner. As instructed, the 3 humans quickly ran to a corner. Cobb was the quickest, grabbing the closest corner. The final corner of the building was taken by Mud itself. Lift on 3. 1, 2, 3. Whoa! As a group lifted the object, they were shocked at how light it had become. Were it not for the incredibly awkward shape, it could have been lifted by a single person. All right, where are we taking this? Cobb yelled around the side of the building towards Mud, holding his part of the building aloft with a single hand. We will be placing this building in front of the mansion. Novus spoke up in a much softer tone, still scanning the streets for the Fagia scouts. How do we get it through the trees? It's way too big for the trail. I've calculated the path through the forest that'll allow us structured passage. Oh no. Cobb's cry of despair put a twang of fear into Novus's heart. First, we need to turn the building into the starboard side and fall the building forward, then push it through those 2 trees. Second, without releasing pressure from the lower left pillar, which will then cause the structure to collapse, we will need to add 27 degrees of yaw rotation and 13 degrees of pitch rotation exactly, even advance 3/5 of a unit north by northwest. While it had taken 10 minutes to descend to the forest trail to the slums at the lightsjoc, it ended up taking several hours to return to the mansion carrying the slum house. Matters were simplified by Mud's careful use of the MITH interface to give directions than Novus's suggestion, but disaster nearly struck as wolves attempted to ambush the group as they navigated the tricky group of trees. The wolves were easily struck down, but a tree was felled in a wayward attack, blocking Mud's intended path. Cobb bypassed the problem by throwing the building over the treetops. Mud berated him for the act, which would cause the highly visible to enemy troops, but the tactic took an hour of meandering and backtracking off the planned course. With the slum house finally in place in front of the Sithlar estate, Mud removed the spell and retrieved its body parts. It was now time to check on Jabrax. 2 Fagia Republic troops sat in their Union-designated rest period, eating their rations. The demi-Wolverine soldier looked enviously at the high-quality honeydew cake ration his Ant-Man friend, while slowly chewing his own goblin jerky. The votes which determined military ration options had, as usual, assigned more budget to the meals eaten by the largest number of voters. Of course, the demi-Wolverine James could also order honeydew cake ration, but it was simply not suitable to his palate. It was overly sweet, to the point of nauseating to all but Ant-Man. Unfortunately, there were very few carnivores in the Republic at the moment, and as a result, the only meat rations were repulsive. After struggling to swallow a disgusting chunk of goblin meat, James washed it down with a glass of cool, pure water. A love of pure water, at least, was something almost every species had in common. The communications officer heard anything interesting. The Ant-Man lifted her head from her cake. Bits of light brown crumbs stuck to her mandibles. Brushing them away with her foreleg, she chittered out a reply. Interesting, Well, this town is rather unusual, I'd say. There have been some very odd sightings since our attack. Her comment tapered off with a soft chittering. James grinned toothily. Interesting. How? Come now, give me something specific. James took a large bite out of the goblin jerky. Some good gossip would do a better job of distracting him from this foul taste of goblin than excessive quantities of salt that had been used to prepare it. Well, the Ant-Man cleaned the antenna between her forelegs as she spoke. There was a report of a flying house over the forest in the east of the town. A flying house? Like one of those floating castles? That was interesting, although not overly rare. We don't think so. The report said that it looked like an old shack, not the sort of place someone rich enough to make their house fly would live. Strange. James rolled a bit of gristle between his teeth. You said sightings, right? Plural. What else? I'm glad you asked. James didn't doubt it. Perhaps the greatest flaw of Ant-Men as communications officers was their love of gossip. They seemed to have a great difficulty understanding the concept of secrecy between allies due to the communal nature. Eventually, the Republic had just given up on trying to enforce data security amongst their kind, choosing instead to have them transmit sensitive information in ciphers that the Ents themselves didn't know how to decode. Information that was deemed low risk was still transmitted unmodified, however. The Ant-Man enthusiastically continued her story. Well, you know how we chased those enemy combatants east of the dungeon, right? Well, along the way, some of our brothers encountered a smithery. When they went in to liberate the smith's riches for the people of Phagia, the store owner attacked them. Guessing that there was more to the story than just a store owner being killed or captured, James pushed for details. And then what happened? Oh, that's the good part. He threw some piles of chains at our brothers. The chains were covered in blades and hooks and such, but he threw them with such a lack of skill that none of our brothers were injured. Everyone thought he was just crazy, but then the chains came to life. They started crawling over people, slicing them up, stabbing them, strangling them, all sorts of nasty things. Wow! James tried to picture the carnage as living chains covered in blades went on a rampage through the platoon. Yeah, wow. Apparently he had dozens of the things, each one slightly different too. The most advanced ones had spools of spring-loaded hook launchers. Did they get the guy? The communications officer hung her head and swayed it side to side. No, the building was not being liberated yet, as far as I've heard. When our brothers retreated to regroup, the chain things did not follow. It was decided that we would let the shop owner remain in place until a high-tiered servant of the people is available to clear him out. James took a sip of water. If we made those himself, it might be dangerous to leave the enchanter that skilled in his own devices. He might be building something even worse. Would you like me to call for a vote to increase the priority of liberating the smithy? The Ant-Man lifted her head and antennae swayed excitedly. No need for a vote. Just some idle speculation. Forget it all about it. James waved his arms in front of himself frantically. Oh, the communications officer lowered her head dejectedly. Letting out a sigh of relief that she gave up, the demi-Wolverine tried to change the subject. So, what about our servants' battle with the city's oligarchy? How's that going? The conflict still occupies our high-tier servants. Ant-Man huffed in annoyance. Really, they should just hurry up and do their job already, taking so long to completely oppose the ideal of Phagia. Is it? James had an uncertain look in his face. Of course it is, making the many wait around for the few. The communications officer raised her head high and looked down at her mandibles towards the sitting demi-Wolverine. Say, what's your skill level in the Phagia Republic? Well, that's, James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, the Ant-Man glowered over James, who turned his head to avoid looking into her massive compound eyes. I have 2 ranks. James spoke softly, looking down at the disgusting goblin meat in his hands. Pathetic. The Ant-Man went back to eating her honeydew cake. After a few bites, she turned her head back towards the now silent James. You should really meditate on the ideal more. Even if you aren't suited for magic use, it will really change the way you see the world and make you a better functioning member of society. I know, I just have a hard time understanding some parts of it. It really is complicated. James took another bite of his jerky. I'll try and do better." "That's the spirit, brother." The communications officer happily dug into her cake. James let out a bitter sigh. It wasn't really the ideal that was complicated. James had hesitated in raising his skill for another reason entirely. He had seen how it changed people. With each level, his friends had become more obsessed with serving the many, and started calling us for votes for even the most trivial of subjects. The way their personalities had shifted so much as they mastered their ideal deeply disturbed James. Still, he couldn't avoid leveling it forever. James snuck a glance at the gossipy communications officer. By the end of the day, everyone in the camp would know his skill rank in the Phagia Republic, and he would never hear the end of it. The elites of Galtheus and Phagia faced each other up top the domed roof of the huge dungeon fortifications. Normal soldiers were pointless in a battle of this kind, and both sides knew it. The normal Republic soldiers had pulled back to focus on smaller tasks that were within their abilities, and the monsters below simply spread across the city unopposed. By now, the Delvers and Guardsmen had all reached the fallback fortifications. The 9 on this rooftop would be determined the fate of the city. On one side stood Leader Ghoul, Captain Algar, High Priest Decitium, and the Samurai Shin. On the other side, 5 servants of Phagia. Towering above the rest stood a massive ant-man, a member of the warrior caste, easily twice as tall as a human, even standing on all 6 legs as she was. Her disproportionately large head supported an equally oversized set of mandibles, an ornate white plate barding covering the majority of her enormous body. Sitting on the ant-man's back was the smallest of the enemy troops, a pixie, less than a handspan tall. Although tiny, his physique was impressive, with rippling muscles quite in contrast to the usual dainty appearance of the Fae. White light shined from his eyes and covered his body, making him difficult to see. His body seemed to tremble with barely contained energy. His hands tightly clutched metal claws, and it was a common mistake amongst inexperienced to assume a physically small creature would lack in strength. Perhaps that was true in a Tier 0, but class levels quickly made such racial differences irrelevant. The human in ragged sackcloth stood beside the ant, a thick metal collar around his neck. By the looks of it, a slave collar. Strange, considering slavery is illegal in the Republic. His bare feet had thick calluses, and his skin was leathery from overexposure to the sun. Wild and tangled grey hair shrouded his face, but it was not the grey of age. It was a bold grey of the Phagia Republic fag. It was clear the ideal of this man had steeped himself the most. Next was a priest. Compared to the vibrant rainbow coloration of Decitium's robes, the Republic's priest's dull grey was extremely muted. Within his hands, he grasped a simple wooden carving of a pyramid, held to the point aiming down. Although he was still young, the spark of fanaticism was clear in his eyes. He scowled hatred at Decitium. From what Ghoul understood, the Church of Phagia saw the Demiurge as an enemy to all life. Unlike the venerable Gnostics, who waged war with magical beasts in order to feed the suffering of Yaldabaoth, the Phagians sought to cooperate with magical beasts in opposition of Yaldabaoth. This put the two churches firmly at odds with each other. At the last amongst them was a handsome, almost statuesque man in a fine suit. It was a man the people from Galtheus recognized, for they had met him only 2 days before at the tournament. Vale Farwind, the visiting diplomat from the Phagia Republic. End of chapter. Chapter 91. Meet. Several thousand years ago, I traveled the world seeking knowledge about those who dwelt on its surface. Once, as I wandered the desert in the north of what is now known as the civilized continent, I happened upon an isolated village. The village was remote, far from any oasis or rivers, with a population of only a few hundred. Weather-worn sandstone homes made it clear that this was no temporary settlement, but a place with a long history. At that time, I had no need to hide my demonic form. My wings and tail were displayed proudly, and those wonderful days before the Empire performed their grand art, information traveled slowly. An isolated village like this did not know of demons, nor the risks that they posed. When I approached the walls, I was welcomed warmly, and I was invited to stay the night in the village chief's home. I was immediately curious about this remote place, had enough food and water to support itself. The water they provided me had a taste of metal. For dinner, they served me meat stew. When I asked what kind of meat it was, they deflected my question. A young boy, a child of a woman who provided the meal, told me that it was dead meat. I laughed at his wordplay. I didn't know what he meant at the time. Early the next morning, after breakfast, the yet more meat stew, I spied my host carrying an empty water barrel towards the centre of town. I followed him, careful not to be noticed, and I had to know where the water came from. Perhaps it was simply some artifact of mage summoning it, but the familiar metallic taste of the water made me unable to accept such a convenient answer. Eventually, we arrived at the temple at the centre of the town. Its intricate carvings were long eroded in the sand-blasting wind of the desert, leaving only the slightest of impressions. Entering the building, and without being noticed, would be difficult. Outside the building, the smell of iron filled the air. I was certain of the answer was inside. After observing for a time, I ambushed and murdered the priest carrying the parcel to the temple. By taking his shape, I managed to enter the building without arousing suspicion. With those stone walls, the smell of iron was even more pronounced. When I entered the building, an elder approached me and I handed him the parcel. He opened the box, and within were dozens of butcher blades. He told me that he was glad that they finally arrived, as the ones they had were wearing out. I nodded. The elder asked me to deliver the package to the holy place. I agreed. As I turned to leave, he stopped me. Sternly, he told me that I needed to prepare before I could enter the holy place, and warned me of the danger of forgetting the rituals. We sat opposite one another in a small room. The elder cast a mind-controlling spell on me. Of course, such a weak power could not work on a demon. This was what I was told, what I was meant to accept as the ultimate truth in that room. That meat grows, the meat bleeds. What you cut away is dead, what remains is alive. The meat cannot move, the meat is at peace. The mantra was repeated 3 times, and each time he used a spell on me. At the conclusion, he allowed me to enter the holy place. I descended the stairs, box in hand. What I saw below the temple was a wide room with a long trough at the center. Within the trough, filled the length, was a pulsing pillar of bleeding meat. Along the sides, dozens of priests worked tirelessly to cut away the ever-growing meat, placing it beside themselves in crates. A spout on the side of the trough was occasionally opened where the blood was fed into the barrels. Through some filtration process, I now know that it was arcane or physical, the blood was purified into water. At that moment, the mystery was solved, and I was filled with joy. The people of this town believed that they could harvest an abomination safely through careful adherence to ritual and hypnosis. Perhaps it would have worked forever had a demon not arrived, for it only took a few heretical thoughts to change everything. What was cut away is alive. The meat can move. The meat is angry. Of course, I myself have eaten the meat stew earlier in that morning. My stomach was torn apart from inside by the raging mass, and I expired shortly thereafter. It was well worth it, however. I returned to that village some time after I had reformed in the abyss. The sandstone building still stood, but the people, nothing remained. A story from Jabrax's past. You should just give up. I can no longer promise you citizenship after your previous display, but I can at least spare your lives. Belafar spoke arrogantly to forces arrayed around him. The local Dallas Association leader crossed his arms and shook his head. Like hell, I'd rather die fighting. Perhaps you don't value your own life, but what about Mayor Fellow? Farwin nodded to the man dressed in a sackcloth, who bowed deeply in return. After waving his arms and muttering for a moment, the man reached into the air and pulled out Guy Fellow. The mayor was in a horrible state, bloody and bruised. His suit was torn, his long gashes covered his torso. Fellow breathed heavily and struggled to remain on his feet. Metal bands and chains held together his arms and legs. Shin spoke with contempt. Such an act only shames you. We will fight only harder to avenge our comrade. Besides, he probably enjoyed it, mumbled Algar. Ghoul gave her a sideways glance and grimaced, but didn't respond. I see. Then he serves no purpose. Vale nodded his head again, and that man in sackcloth swung his arm. Mayfellow's head left his body. Leader Ghoul and the High Priestess Etium exploded into motion. Ghoul appeared behind the slave-like man and swung his halberd down towards his head, the blade like guillotine. The man with the sackcloth swayed to the side with the smallest motion, avoiding the blade by the barest of hairs. At the same time, Dicitium reached Mayfellow's tumbling head. His attempt was thwarted, however, as the head was struck from below, sending it flying out of the priest's grasp. There, where her head had been, hovered a pixie. Dicitium used the mana that he had prepared to heal Fellow instead to strike the pixie, sending a blast of divine force crashing into him. Behind the pixie, a blast of grey energy shot forward from the pagan priest. The rainbow energy of Yaldabaoth and the grey energy of the people clashed, and both dispersed. The pixie became a blur as he accelerated to incredible speeds in an instant, smashing into Dicitium's unprotected torso. The High Priest flew backwards from the impact, bouncing like a rag doll down the domed roof. The Ant-Man soldier's attempt to bite Ghoul from behind was blocked by Shin's katana. The two were quickly locked in a rapid exchange of blows. It was quickly clear that the Ant-Man was superior in both power and speed. Whenever she went for a decisive blow, however, she faltered. Her 6 legs, antennae, and even her eyes would be under attack by something unseen, forcing her to shift her balance to roll with the blows to avoid injury. Ghoul continued attempting to strike the man in the sackcloth. It was proving to be a slippery target. Every time Ghoul struck him, the man would dodge with the slightest motions. At the same time, the man would pull various weapons from seemingly thin air and counter-attack with it. After a single attack, he would release the weapon, which vanished just as it had arrived. Seeing the situation was going poorly, Ghoul glanced towards Algar, who was now engaged in a magical duel with General Farwind. Ghoul and Algar made eye contact. A moment later, Ghoul once again vanished, this time appearing behind Farwind, forcing him to block. At the same time, Algar struck the slave with a wide-area blast of magic. No matter which way the man in the sackcloth tried to go, he would be struck. Up, down, left, right, backwards, or forwards, or would be consumed by the ball of electricity. So, instead he walked in a different direction. To those outside, his body shrank inward and on itself. At times his interior became visible. He dodged the attack by stepping in a direction that nobody but him had ever noticed. Priest Dicitium stood unsteadily and spat out a mouthful of blood. Already the pixie was in front of him again. He focused divine energy through the statue of Yaldabaoth and blasted it towards the pixie. He didn't even try to dodge. His smirk turned to a surprise as the spell actually neared him. Turning his small head, the pixie saw the priest of the people skewered by Shin's katana. Behind them, the Ant-Man struggled against unseen forces, unable to move. His last-second attempt to dodge was thwarted by the same unseen force that held down the Ant-Man. The pixie screamed as divine energy pushed down on it. Dicitium did not relent, powering the spell until its mana pool ran dry. Nothing remained of the pixie when he was done. Shin, too, completed his work, getting the rival priest by a vertical bisection. Dicitium did not have the time to celebrate, however, as a dagger was thrust into his heart from a direction that he did not know existed. Although there was no visible entrance wound, the damage was clear and the blade existed in front of the priest's chest. A moment later, the dagger faded away, replaced by a flow of thick blood. If the priest had maintained his composure, he might have saved enough mana to cure the wound, but in the heat of the moment, he had used all of it to kill his foe. "Damn it!" Those were his last words as he fell to the cold stone roof. "So what exactly is the plan with this shack?" Cobb stretched out his arms after completing the delivery. "We will destroy this building when we leave, thus deceiving the enemy into believing Sithlaw's mansion has been destroyed and leading them to believe that we are dead, thus calling off the pursuit." Bud finally revealed his master plan to the humans. "What?" Cobb clenched his fist and shouted, "That plan is crap! My plan has nothing to do with excrement. There are so many ways this plan can screw up." Cobb held a hand and began counting his fingertips. 1. If any soldiers or scouts show up before we leave, we're boned. 2. The shack is smaller than the mansion. They'll notice. 3. There won't be any Sithlaw stuff in the wreckage. 4. Sithlaw's corpse won't be in the wreckage. 5. If they have anyone who can reverse the damage with magic, you again are boned. 6. I ran out of fingers, but trust me, there's more. Novus was sprawled out on the grass nearby, exhausted from carrying the building. Well, it would buy us some time at least. Aside from the first one, those things I probably won't notice until they're long gone. And maybe they'll just think Sithlar took his stuff and ran away before burning his house down. Yeah, whatever. Just see if you can leave already. Annoyance clear, Cobb stomped off into the house. I thought the plan would be good. Can't believe I carried this house through the forest with us. Bud followed soon after. In the sub-basement, Jabrax manipulated the console on the curved wall of the drive room. When Mud entered the room, she turned to greet him. Oh, Mud, I think I've figured it out. I'm still working on the weapons, though. The idea of the mansion housing weapons interested Mud, but there was a more immediate concern. Jabrax began moving the house immediately. Fine. A dense grid of countless small runes were drawn on the surface of the table she now worked at. Placing a dainty finger on one, she dragged the rune across the table into an empty section of the engraving near the top. Behind Mud, the squirting energies atop the Tego drive flowed faster in a wild dance. As their speed increased, the energies actually appeared to be separate from each other, forming a curved boundary line between the two hemispheres, while the entire sphere rotated rapidly. As the energy settled into their new shape, the whirring sounds of the machinery filled the room. The motors on both sides of the building activated, and Mud fell on his face as the building unexpectedly lurched upwards. End of chapter. Chapter 92. Multi-directional Melee and Multi-Kostrika Mansion. Farwind was not pleased with how the battle was proceeding. He had brought forces fully capable of defeating the defenders of Carthaeus, but the reports had greatly underestimated the strength of the individual Shin. He had only recently arrived in Pankor from across the ocean, so information of his abilities was scarce. So far, both the state priest Homian and the weird little pixie Polus had been killed due to Shin's interference, and the soldier Karstan seemed to be constantly befuddled by invisible allies. The only saving grace was that Shin's ability seemed to be unable to follow Nemo in his private roads. Nemo was an odd man. He took the philosophies of Phagia Republic still to heart, as much more profound way than most. As he had risen in power, he had begun granting himself less and less luxuries. Now, as perhaps the strongest individual in the nation, he lived an almost absurdly austere life. He owned no possessions save for the sackcloth which he wears, only to avoid bothering others with his nakedness. The collar on his neck was created of his own behest. A unique enchant was cast upon it, requiring him to follow any legal order he receives from a legitimate citizen of the Republic. Through a unique combination of skills, he has no need to eat or drink water. Supposedly, he has not consumed anything for years. Despite his peculiarities, he was a highly capable fighter. His unique skill, which allowed him to travel in ways that Farwind did not fully understand, and his powerful ideals, which allowed him to attack from unpredictable ways, made him a force to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, even Nemo could not land a clean blow on Shin. In addition to unseen forces the samurai was using to pin down the ant, he acted as though he possessed a precognitive ability or a supernatural senses. Even as Belafar lamented on the lack of information on Shin, he saw the black-armored youth leap suddenly to his left, only for a trident to stab from the air as a former location a moment later. Grasped by the leathery skin and hand of Nemo, while their side had taken losses, the other side was not doing much better. Already their priest bled out on the roof, not yet dead, but soon. None of his allies had enough free time to feed him a potion when Nemo was on the prowl. Algar had been locked up in a battle of ideals with Valafar himself, her lightning and more subtle thunder dragon magic competing with the demon's own wind magic. Of course, Valafar had other ideals that he could use which might make him more effective, but there was too much risk in those magics being linked back to some of his previous exploits and expose him as a demon. There was no need to be hasty. Already Algar was mentally exhausted, and probably running low on mana. Whatever resource Shin was using to keep the battle in his favor, it would not last forever. The soldier ant was a specialist in defense, like Pankel's own Prince Cain. While she was kept at bay now, she had yet to be damaged. Nemo was untouchable in his realm, and Valafar was not limited to his humans when it came to mana. The demon needed only stretch to fight out, and victory would be theirs. Once again, a dagger leapt from an unseen place, nearly striking a fatal blow. Only by constantly moving in unpredicted directions did Kage Forest remain alive through the onslaught of the ever-changing weapon. Not for the first time, Ghoul felt envious of his friend Mald, who had the intuition-enhanced unique skill of his. Dodging such attacks would be a simple matter. Instead, he just had an enhanced sense of smell. What a failure of a unique. Sure, it had aided Ghoul in the past in many ways, but it couldn't save his friend Dositium. It couldn't protect the town of Gatheus. It couldn't stop the weird teleporting magic. This was the sort of magic Ghoul had never seen before. He was certain of it. He took a deep whiff of the air, trying to check if the scent of the manor was at least similar to something that he'd encountered before. As a pair of shears cut through his leg, Thuggy smelled only the scent of ideal of Foggy Republic, the ideal of abstinence, very common ideals, and unlikely to be related to his movement. There was also the strong scent of an unknown ideal around the weapons, although Ghoul discounted that from being merely related to offense. There was no ideal to account for the teleportation at all. At that realization, Ghoul shifted his thinking. Was this some sort of physical skill? It was definitely not merely a high-speed movement ability. Ghoul would have recognized something so common immediately. Invisibility and intangibility also did not fit. Once again, Leader Ghoul sniffed wildly in the air. Perhaps, if he couldn't see or hear what direction it was coming from, he could smell him. And he could. But what his ever-reliable nose told him was incomprehensible. The smell was approaching, but from a direction that didn't exist. It wasn't as though he simply could not tell what direction at all. That was the sensation he was familiar with. Rather, he could tell exactly which direction the smell came from, but it was not a direction at all. The confusion quickly brought on a headache. Ghoul was not a great thinker or a philosopher. He had never managed to learn an ideal despite several attempts. He had gotten where he was now through mastery of his body. So, he simply stopped thinking about the why of it, trusting himself fully to his nose. Leader Ghoul shut his eyes and struck towards a place that wasn't a place. He grinned in satisfaction as he felt his halberd connect. The huge Ant-Man lunged at Shin again, pushing aside dozens of fallen soldiers and delvers that clung to it. Despite their numbers, there had not been enough strength to compete with the huge insect. Still, their efforts held the beast back long enough for him to dodge the mandibles. In the ant's violent shaking, one of the spirits dislodged and faded away, his soul finally returning to the cycle of reincarnation. The soul of Shin's grandmother whispered a warning in his ear. The samurai leapt to the side, narrowly avoiding a spear thrust from the very air. Before he could retaliate, the enemy vanished. In his moment of distraction, yet more spirits were destroyed by the thrashing of the insect. Shin concentrated corrupted mana into his blade and swung it at the Ant-Man. The sword deflected uselessly off the thing's carapace, and the mana dispersed on contact. The ant cannot hurt Shin, and Shin cannot hurt the ant. A stalemate, one which Shin would eventually lose as the recently deceased pass in the cycle, leaving him to fight with only more permanent comrades. Shin examined the battlefield. The ant could not harm, the strange slave man could not strike, and Valafar, who could simply fly out of range with his attacks with the wind magic. Even his spirits had a little luck grabbing a hold of the general, as he would slip between the fingers like a breeze. While he was confident at the beginning, his presence on the battlefield was rapidly becoming useless. Instead of dragging things out, he needed to act aggressively, as he had done before, using all of the resources in a single attack, and, if that did not work, flee the fight another day. With his mind made up, Shin placed the family blade back into its sheath. Lowering his stance, he gave a command to the dead. "Come here, give me your regrets. I will bring you vengeance. The ones responsible for your suffering will see justice." Those spirits that remained halted their task and rushed to Shin's side. Rage was clear on their faces. They had all been killed crudely, indirectly, without cause, without mercy. What little of their strength remained was granted to Shin, to be the executioner on their behalf. As the spirits faded into his sword, only two remained before him. Mere fellow and a smile on his lips, granting his strength and faded. Dositium looked deep into Shin's eyes. His lips moved, but his words were not audible. This was a spirit with lingering regrets. "Is it the golem?" The shade of the priest nodded. His soul could not know peace with his failure. To the Zitium, the golem fleeing the town in chaos was a greater threat than any invasion, even as the invasion had caused his own death. A loose construct was an existential threat to all life. The shade took a deep purse into Shin's eyes, his black orbs drilling into Shin's heart. Whatever answers the spirit found in there, he eventually granted Shin his strength, and like the others, he faded away. Shin's sheathed katana now pulsed with black energy. Settling into his stance, he took careful aim at his target and waited for the chance to strike. Algar sent a bolt of electricity towards Farwind, but it was too weak. Vale Farwind knocked the spell aside with the back of his hand and swung the wind-cloaked fist towards the guardswoman's head. His attack did not have a time to land, however. The world seemed to lurch as a black line divided in two. From the clear blue sky diagonally down, the world of the domed roof of the dungeon fortification, and that line passed directly through General Farwind. Ah! Blood spilled from Farwind's mouth as his body separated from his shoulder to hip. An explosion rang out as the air rushed back into the gap in the sky created by the strike. Black tendrils expanded from the two halves of the general's body, as though trying to put him back into one piece. The halves repelled each other. However, they had only grown farther apart with each attempt. Below, the domed building buckled, and the integrity compromised by the long, thin gash cut into its surface. The gash, which now actively pushed and spread itself wider. Chunks of masonry fell away into the dark interior, and to the side the association leader swung his halberd rapidly with his eyes closed, the weapon seeming to disappear with each strike. Its blade was coated with blood. General Farwind is, Among all the action, the ant stared only at General Farwind, cut in half as he was. It was clear that those were no human organs spitting out of his chest, as he desperately tried to restore his body. Bits of his true anatomy would poke through from time to time. It was obvious now that he was a demon. Taking advantage of his damaged state, Algar covered the demon's body in a squeezing snake of electricity, slowly sizzling away at the flesh even as its fangs bit into him. Must! Although he was now free of the spirits holding him still, and the soldier ant did not attack. Instead, it entered a fugue state, its antennae swaying wildly. The trance lasted only a moment before it returned to its senses. Shin was too wary of the strange behavior to capitalize on its moment of stillness. As it returned to wakefulness, the ant yelled head above the crashing falling stone on the ongoing clashing of the combat between Ghoul and the nearly naked man. Pankel combatants, I have received permission by the Council of Emergency Delegates to offer a temporary cessation of conflict to discuss the possibility of the demonic interference in relations between Pankel and Fagia. At her proclamation, the body of Farwind finally gave in to its damage. His eyes closed, and for a moment he fully took on his demonic form. Black, beetle-like wings sprouted from his back, a pointed tail emerged from his backside, and short horns erupted from his head. A moment later, both halves of his body were pulled through a much too small hole in reality. The general was gone. Ghoul and the nearly half-naked man stopped their combat at the time. Ghoul was covered in scratches, cuts, and bruises across his exposed parts of his body, and his armor was nicked and dented. When the nearly naked man stepped into visibility, he looked even worse. Deep gashes crossed his shoulders and bled freely. Breathing heavily, Leader Ghoul slowly nodded. We will talk. Mud had quickly climbed to its feet. That lurch had ascertained that felt like the mansion had moved, and its domain confirmed it. The domain being linked to the mansion had lifted along with it. What Mud had now saw within his raised domain was that the method by which the structure moved. From the far side of the house, a large multi-segmented legs had unfolded from the interior of the walls, each segment nearly as long as the depth of the house. 8 legs, ending in points, resembled the creature Mud had seen in the street markets of Galtheus, a Tier 0 beast known as a crab. Jibrax nodded to herself and looked around the room for a moment. Well, I got it started, and I think I know how to control it, but it would be impossible to drive since I can't see where I'm going outside. Sithclaw must have made some other means of seeing out of the building, or maybe this just was never completed. I can see outside with my domain. Oh, right. I suppose that could work. All right, tell me which direction to go then. Jibrax hovered her hand over the controls awaiting Mud's direction. What is the status of the weapons you mentioned previously? Oh, right, those. The demon gave a jagged-toothed smile. Want me to try and activate them? Yes. Target the location 20 units to the west and 5 units below my current location. This should be suitable for destroying the slum house as per the plan, Mud said. Well, if you say so. With glee, and with which she began rapidly manipulating the console, filled with Mud was concerned. Perhaps the fact that she had manipulated it into giving specific order to fire a weapon instead of simply firing it herself, it was a warning sign that, Mud's thoughts were cut short as the building was sent stumbling backwards by the massive concussive force along with the muffled sounds of the explosion. A few automatic adjustments of the crab-like legs rebalanced the mansion, but all that remained of the shack was a crater that extended well beyond Mud's perception. Not a trace of the slum house remained, having been completely vaporized by a cannon that had emerged from the front of the left side of the house. Jibrax disappeared up the stairs to examine the damage, but stomped back down with her arms crossed. Something that would be bigger than that. Maybe wipe out the whole city or something. Mud lamented its failed plan. It really was excrement. Walk us west. End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please consider supporting the author from the link down below. Otherwise, if you wish to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so, like liking, subscribing, and possibly even becoming a patron. Otherwise, the easiest way would be to share. And until the next video, I hope that you all have a good one, and I'll see you then. Cheers.